Hello, everybody. I'm Michael Monaco.
And I'm Bobby Salveson, and we are the Haz Mat guys, bringing you the knowledge and insight to make your job a little bit easier.
Before we get into the show, let's thank today's sponsors. For 30 years, first responders have trusted FLIR's Identifinder radiation security products to keep them safe. From PDRs to portals, FLIR delivers leading-edge solutions. Enter for your chance to win a new R100 PDR at FLIR.com/winR100.
The Haz Mat Guys podcast is brought to you in part by Qualtech. Qualtech's radiation safety services support all of your rad needs. Our complete instrument service program includes calibration, repair, and tracking software, so your instruments are always ready. Learn more at Qualtech, that's spelled QALTEK.com, or 208-523-5557. All right, guys, we're back, and this episode is about fire codes and hazardous materials. So just basically how the East meets the West, I guess it would be. And we brought on our friend, Jim Jaracz. Let me give you a little background on Jim. He joined the fire service in 1989. He's worked as a volunteer, a career, and in industrial fire departments. He served in positions ranging from firefighter all the way up to assistant fire chief. He's got a Master of Science from Occupational Safety Management, and he holds several certificates related to codes and standards, which is pretty much what we're going in. And he also, this is where I know him from, he instructs code-related classes through various state entities and through the National Fire Academy, which is where I got him. So, Jim, I really thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Bobby. Thanks, Mike.
No problem. Thanks for having.
Sure.
So let's get right into the meat of this thing. Explain for our audience the origin and development of codes and standards in relationship to hazardous materials.
Sure. Well, when you think about codes and standards, a lot of these date back to the early 1900s. In fact, the sprinkler standard that was developed by NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, was originally created in the late 1890s. So codes and standards have been around for a long time. When you think about the way things were developed, a lot of times policy comes out of tragedy. So you might have a major fire, like let's say the Iroquois Theater in 1903, and you look at some of the issues there, exiting, overcrowding, interior finish, things like that. And people say, we got to write a code that addresses this type of an issue. Well, the same thing with hazardous materials. When you look at a lot of the inventions and the things that were developed and created back in about that same time, late 1800s, early 1900s, petroleum, electric, radio, and on down the line, a lot of those things dealt with hazardous materials, and they learned, in many times the hard way, about how dangerous these chemicals and different types of materials, products, and so forth can be. So there were regulations in place, and a lot of this also came out of waste, where we put the material. A lot of it got flushed down the river, so to speak, but we started seeing how the pollution and everything took effect, so that started to be regulated as well. And as we moved into the late 1940s, after World War II, we found so many different ways to apply a lot of these hazardous materials in different manufacturing fields, different developments, inventions, and so forth, and enhancing a lot of the stuff that we already know. But at the same time, being in the hazmat field, when you're dealing with transporting, dealing with storage, different types of products that might be incompatible when they're next to each other, they don't get along so well, you can really have some problems. So that's essentially how we started looking at hazmat codes and how they've developed to what we have today.
So in the field of codes, who are the big players in the game? Who are the ones that, if I was a hazmat technician, I want to start to dive into this, who are the agencies that I should be starting to put on my radar?
Well, sure. Two agencies right now, the International Code Council and the National Fire Protection Association, are essentially the code and the standards. And let me explain the little differences between those two. A code is what is required. So, for example, you might walk into a business, nightclub, restaurant, something like that, and you'll see an exit sign. The exit sign is required by code. How that exit sign is designed, or let's say a sprinkler system is another example. The sprinkler system might be required by code, but the standard NFPA 13 tells you how that sprinkler system is supposed to be designed and installed. So we've got the two different code entities, ICC, International Code Council, and National Fire Protection Association. A lot of the jurisdictions have adopted ICC, and that stemmed from what was known as the Southern Standard Code, the Uniform Code, and the BOCA Code, dating back well into the early 1900s. And these code groups basically got together towards the 1990s. And a lot of the codes said the same thing, just in a different way. So they took the best of all three, essentially, in a nutshell, formulated the ICC out of that. And the first International Fire Code Building Code I-Code family was published in 2000. And since then, the codes have grown and changed and transitioned into what we have today. And about every 3 years, you see a cycle or a code revision come out. Some of it's extensive. Some of it maybe not so much. It might be subtle, or it might be the same, depending on what's happened over the last 3 years.
Jim, is there like a certain regularity that they update these things? Is it like every 2 years, every 5 years, or do they do it whenever needed?
Every 3 years is when the ICC revises, and typically the NFPA does that as well, every 3 years. Now, the NFPA also has standards, not just for sprinklers, not just for alarms, but for a conglomerate of different things, dealing with life safety, dealing with equipment, PPE, all those different aspects. Sometimes those standards will be revised every 3 years. Sometimes they might see a change where they take a certain section of that standard and maybe develop it into a new standard altogether, or a new standard is introduced. So there is a variation, but by and large, you're looking at about a 3-year cycle for revision work.
So when these codes and standards come out, who enforces them? Like, is that like a federal, local? Is it like super local, like each department? Who's really the responsible party to sit down and has the muscle to make somebody follow this?
Well, essentially, the local jurisdiction is the one that would adopt and enforce the code in effect. And they'd also adopt the standards in effect. Where I'm from in Indiana, we have what's called a statewide fire code. If I use it up in my area, northwest Indiana, it's the exact same thing that they might be using on the exact opposite side of the state. However, some states allow individual jurisdictions, cities and towns and what have you, to adopt the codes themselves. So one jurisdiction might adopt, let's say, for example, the 2006 edition. The town right next door might be adopting the 2009 edition. So there can be a little bit of a challenge there between what's required in one town versus another. And that tends to create a little complexity for construction designers, architects, builders, people like that might have to seek code guidance for a project to do it in one town versus another. But it depends on the local jurisdiction, and they have to be adopted. And if you look at the code, in the very front of it, the first few pages, you'll notice that there's a sample ordinance that's written that allows that jurisdiction to have some verbiage already established so that they can do a nice, clean adoption process for whatever code they choose meets their jurisdictional needs.
Talk to me about how these codes, they address the hazardous materials world, because we had actually just the other night I was working, we have this place that's maybe first or second due within a half mile of our firehouse, and this place has every chemical. It's seemingly every chemical known to man. It's basically in a solid. It's in an open warehouse, and it says that any alarm here, hazardous materials has to come. So we came in there, and it turned out to be like, an automatic alarm, but these places have tremendous amounts of hazardous materials. This is national. So in effect, how do the codes address the hazardous materials, and at what point do people kick it up to a national level? Like, is there a national code, and then you can get a little more stringent in your county, and then a little more stringent in your neighborhood? How does this work?
Well, a lot of times, like as I said, the jurisdictions will adopt the code, and even though it's titled the quote-unquote international code, it's still used on a local level. But there are other national requirements, such as OSHA and EPA requirements, things like that, that coincide with it. So the facility that you're discussing, without naming a name or anything, I would presume that they probably have some OSHA reportable information that they have to keep as far as documentation. They probably have some EPA stuff that's going to be required as well, as far as the type of chemicals they have, the quantities of chemicals, where they're stored, and so forth. But the fire code that we see and fire inspectors across the nation enforce are broken down into a set of chapters. For example, Chapter 50 is the Hazardous Materials Code. Basically, everything that deals with a hazardous material is addressed there. But when you start looking at the code a little bit more, you'll find that there's sections on flammable and combustible liquids and aerosols and oxidizers and different things like that. So depending on what specifically you're dealing with, you might have a specific chapter that goes above and beyond just Chapter 50, which is the Haz Mat chapter of that. Likewise, NFPA has the Hazardous Materials Code, which is called NFPA 400. That code is also enforceable if it's adopted on a local level. Now, NFPA 1, which is NFPA's fire code, also has some content in there that comes out of their flammable and combustible liquid code, which is NFPA 30. So a lot of these codes talk to each other, and they regulate and require a lot of the same things, but you just have to identify what the product is you're dealing with and what chapter or what section of that code would be most applicable. Tell you a funny story. I went to Pennsylvania a couple years ago to the National Apple Harvest Festival, and I learned a lot about apple growing and that sort of thing. But when you think about fruit ripening processes, there's a lot of ethylene gas that's installed or used in that process. Well, we know the hazards that coincide with ethylene gas. But by the same token, when you're thinking about a lot of these products, the fruit products, I should say, food and so forth, in order to keep them in an inert atmosphere so that they don't ripen quickly and are able to transport or something like that, there's other products that might be used as well. Firefighters need to understand what those are, and they need to understand, just by looking at a building, what kind of hazards might be presented. It's called an environmental scan. When you think about your response jurisdiction or anything like that, looking around, identifying some of the businesses, and thinking, okay, we've got this chemical facility here, what do they deal with? And peel that onion back and look a little bit deeper, and then start identifying within the fire code what chapters are going to be applicable, as I mentioned before.
Well, speaking of that, of all the different codes and stuff, I got a quick question for you, and I'll back this up with a little story to understand where I'm coming from. My family comes from a family of builders, and one of the things that they complained about the most was conflicts in standards and codes, where in order to, say, meet the EPA Swift Water Act, they had to violate 2 or 3 other codes to do so, and then they would get fined for violating one code in order to meet the other. Is that something that has been, as far as hazmat codes go, has been cleaned up, or is there still conflicts among the codes even within the hazmat group?
But that's a good question and a tough question, Mike. I would presume that in many ways, and I've seen this before just on doing basic level inspections. Let's say you have a conflict between what the fire code requires and what the electrical code requires. It depends on a lot of variables, but hashing it out with that other inspector, identifying what the risk is, and then many times the inspector of the jurisdiction may require the most stringent in order to cover all aspects of what that code is. And I understand what you're saying as far as violating one code to meet another, that sort of thing. A lot of times jurisdictions might call on a third party as well, and they might get a code specialist or somebody to come out and help them identify what specific aspects of that code are supposed to be enforced in this position and what might be in another.
Is that a third-party consultant, or is that somebody that would come from like an office that you work at?
No. That'd be a third-party consultant, and I would recommend, if a fire department, whatever state they're operating out of, what they should do is probably take a look at what third-party folks are available in their jurisdiction that specialize with their specific code. one of the places you can look is, and I'll say this briefly, NFPA codes and standards are written by technical experts or SMEs, subject matter experts, and it's a consensus process. So a lot of times the codes and standards that are written are represented by folks that work in industry. Maybe they're manufacturers of a certain product, they use a product. Might even be firefighters that have an interest in whatever that issue might be. Those are the folks that are going to hash it out and write down what the code is actually going to say. In the beginning of any NFPA standard, you can look at that technical committee and identify some of those folks that are on there. And in many ways, those might be the people to lean on and get some more specific advice or guidance on what that code might recommend.
As far as the reporting, right? Isn't there was some, I remember when I was involved in the volunteer fire department, there was a reporting system that had to be submitted to the fire departments. It was like a report.
Sure. There's Tier 2 reports, TIER, and then the Roman numeral 2 that are required to be submitted to the local fire department right now, January, February, up until early March, identifying what the hazardous materials are that they have on site, if they exceed the maximum allowable quantities for that product, what the product is, where it's at, the quantity of that product, and any type of contingency measures that might be in place as well to reduce the potential for any kind of risk. But the Tier 2 reporting for each state or each entity can be found on the EPA website. So if you went to epa.gov and typed in, easiest way to do it, this is how I do it, I type in Tier 2, TIER, Roman numeral 2 in the search box. It comes up, then it'll say search requirements by state, click on whatever state you live in, and then it'll tell you what the reporting requirements are, and it'll give you the documents that have to be filled out. Now that's for the user, for somebody that might house or use or store or even dispose of certain types of chemicals or hazardous materials. But knowing that as a fire inspector, and even as a responder on a hazmat rig or anybody else that might be going to hazmat calls, it's important to understand that. One of the things is that I think a lot of fire departments, they kind of miss the boat on this one. Right now, the jurisdictions should be getting envelopes mailed to them. Everything from gas stations to storage facilities are going to submit these documents in. It's incumbent on the local fire department to recognize that what the businesses are doing is notifying them that, yes, we do in fact have hazardous materials on property. This is what they are. This is where they're at. And that jurisdiction should incorporate that into their pre-incident planning, maybe the tours of the community, whatever that department calls it. Go out there, visit with the folks, let them know that you're aware of what's going on. Take a look at what's happening within that facility, what kind of process is going on. And at the same time, it's not just water-based fire suppression that you might be dealing with there. You might have halon, CO2, dry chemical, wet chemical agent, other types of suppression systems that firefighters may not be exposed to on a daily basis like they would be with sprinklers. And understanding what's there is going to dramatically impact the ability to provide an effective response if they have to get called out to that facility.
Wow, so it's not enough to just know that the chemical is there. We want to be able to sit down with the people that run the facility and say, what is it? What is your game plan for dealing with this? And how do we fit in to not make this worse?
Exactly. It's part of the hazmat management plan and partnering with the business community as well. You're dealing with some jurisdictions that are very small, rural, that might have a co-op, but they still have chemicals. They might have a grocery store. They still have chemicals that they have there, or local hardware. To something as big as the jurisdiction that you folks are from, where there's hundreds and thousands, perhaps, different businesses. A lot of it is pretty tough to bite off, especially for a larger department. But there's some other places, too, that you can look at to get some guidance and some direction on how to deal with hazmats. Most counties have what's called a local emergency planning committee. And that business that sent you the document that says we have this type of chemical and this is where it's at also has to report to the LEPC, Local Emergency Planning Committee. That county entity is going to take that information, file it, help develop an emergency response plan in addition to what you might have on the fire department, and identify other resources that might be available. Let's say, for example, communications or EMS or logistics or who knows what else is out there. But getting with that LEPC as a firefighter is going to be beneficial as well to help identify additional resources that might be capable of coming in and helping mitigate an emergency. Another agency is the State Emergency Response Committee. Those folks also are going to get a copy of that document, the Tier 2 form, and they're going to be able to help structure some sort of response or mitigation tactic along with you, and again, just to make it safer for your community.
Great. So for those that are out there that are listening to this, some really great information as far as where to go to make your response safer, to keep your hazmat team better, and to know what's going on in your community. So let's take a minute here and hear about today's sponsors.
FLIR, a global leader in CBRNE detection solutions, has exciting news for Hazmat Nation. FLIR is giving away one of its new Identifinder R100 personal radiation detectors each month in 2017. Enter for your chance to win at FLIR.com/winR100. This rugged PRD delivers immediate threat alarms to keep frontline responders safe. It also features integrated Bluetooth connectivity that enables situational awareness beyond the front line and up the chain of command. It is IP67 rated to protect against dust, is water submersible up to 1 meter, and drop test compliant to 1.5 meters. For over 30 years, first responders have trusted FLIR's Identifinder radiation security products to keep them safe and prepared. Over 20,000 instruments are fielded globally. From personal radiation detectors to portals, FLIR delivers leading-edge solutions for our first responders. Remember to visit FLIR.com/winR100 to win. All right, let's pick this up where we left off. We are here with Jim Jaracz, one of my good friends, and we are going through hazardous materials codes for, codes as they pertain to hazardous materials is probably a better way of saying with that. So without further ado, Jim, give us a brief overview of the inspector. When I think of an inspector, I think of like a guy that drives around in a special car and checks out buildings and looks for building deficiencies. Yeah, has a couple of donuts and whatnot. But you know what? On the other side of that coin, where me and Mike work in a major metropolitan area, our bosses are a little afraid of us doing this code enforcement on the hazardous materials because there's so many potentials for mixing and matching and stuff like that. Who is the inspector in your mind?
Well, the inspector is basically the eyes and ears for that fire department. They're the ones that are going to be out there almost patrolling the jurisdiction, identifying risk, and looking at new construction being developed, and dealing with, in this case, hazardous materials, the compliance, the storage, and that sort of thing. It's incumbent on the inspector, too, to make sure that they understand, what information is going to benefit the firefighting crews, the responders. In some jurisdictions, it might be a civilian inspector that's hired on that's not part of the suppression team. In others, you might have firefighters that were on an engine or a ladder or something like that, and then they promoted into or transferred into an inspector role. But that person is the one that's going to be out there identifying some of this issue. And quite frankly, my knowledge of chemicals and how they mix and that sort of thing is probably nothing compared to what you guys have. But if you tell me I've got XYZ product over here, I know where to look it up in a code book and say, you're allowed to have 100 pounds of this, or 300 gallons, or whatever it is, what the threshold might be. But knowing those requirements, I can go to you as a hazmat guy and say, hey, I got this business over here, and they've got 500 pounds of X chemical. You might look at that and say, ooh, that sounds pretty scary. We need to go out there and take a better look at it. But without that person out there on a daily walkthrough of the community, it can be detrimental to the emergency responders.
All right. So how do we take the inspector and tie them in then to the suppression staff, the people that are going out there?
Yeah, the key to that is communication, making sure that it's a two-way street. The fire inspector knows who to contact within the suppression staff and let them know, hey, I'm over here in this area. Why don't you send your companies over here with me? We'll do a walkthrough. Likewise, the suppression folks might be able to go to that inspector and say, we understand there's a new building coming in, or we responded to this location for an activated alarm, what have you, the other day. We saw some issues. What's going on there? That the tier 2 that we talked about earlier, it's a great communication piece also that inspectors can share, in addition to safety data sheets that might come in for various products to present to the suppression staff, and let those folks know, this is what's happening. These are some of the chemicals that are in this building as opposed to the one next door, and together they can formulate a more safer environment for everybody.
That's great information, Jim. So what do you think the future is going to bring to us in this, I guess, hazardous materials codes world that's kind of, I think, is difficult?
Yeah, what's ahead?
I think a lot of things that are going to be ahead are more chemicals, more developments, more hazards that are out there. Earlier tonight on television, I watched a segment of the news that talked about the marijuana industry for medical marijuana and different things like that. We're seeing almost half the states in the union right now going that way. So we've got a new hazard that firefighters might be addressing. What's going to be beyond that? The sky's the limit with a lot of this thing, but it's important for firefighters to not be afraid of the code, but to understand how to apply it, know where to go for resources, talk to your local fire inspectors, talk to those folks that are writing those codes and standards, and ask those questions. I've got this place in my jurisdiction. What is the applicable standard for it? How should I be addressing this? And essentially just walking through maybe a chapter or so, or sit down with your response team and see what some of the codes are that are going to be affecting how you respond to an incident.
Excellent. All right, so I got one more quick question for you. Being the code person that you are, I'm sure you've sat through some horrific classes. What is your top way that you get through the most boring class?
Well, that's a great question. The top way I get through it, I take an active interest in things. I do a little research prior to going to that class. Everything from identifying who the instructor is to where maybe that person worked and some of the topics that are going to be discussed. I think I get through it like pretty much everybody else does. You take the meat and potatoes and you think, how is this going to apply to me? And maybe if you have an 8-hour class and you only take away 2 or 3 nuggets from that and you say, this is how I'm going to apply it, it's still going to be worthwhile information. I've sat through some tough courses, especially when you're dealing with hazardous materials, but I think a lot of people recognize, acute exposure, a very low amount of ppm can be really, really detrimental without the right PPE, without the right knowledge. And just like when you respond to a hazmat incident, everybody takes a slowdown. It's the same thing here. When we start looking at the different chemicals, the codes that are going to be required, slow down with that too. Read thoroughly. Look at the code books. Read the exceptions in there. When you look at the tables in the codes for maximum allowable quantities, make sure you're dealing with the right product. You look at the footnotes on those tables as well so that you can find out if there's anything that's not going to be applicable to what a code requires. It's all about baby steps in the end.
Fantastic, I love it. Jim. Fantastic. All right, so Jim, how can we get a hold of you?
You can get a hold of me at firecodeguy@gmail.com. Firecodeguy, all one word, lowercase, @gmail.com. Or I'm on Twitter at firecodeguy. And I'll put some stuff on there dealing with fire protection, safety, different things like that periodically. But if you have a question or something specifically, I'll be happy to help out. Do me a favor, just put in there in the subject line, Haz Mat Guys Podcast, so I know what to look for when I see it, and do the best I can to help you, or at least steer you in a direction where you're going to get the most benefit.
Yeah, this is the guy I go to for my fire code questions. He's my dealer.
I've never
gives
been
me the
referred
fix.
to as a dealer before, but
he's my code dealer. He's so good at
He
it.
passes you little books, like secretly at the night.
yeah, behind the
first
back,
one's free.
that kind of thing.
All right, Jim. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Sure, thank
we
you.
Really appreciate it. And
Thanks, Bobby. Thanks,
I'm
Mike.
sure we're going to be getting together with you soon.
Jim, be safe out there. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Haz Mat Guys.
You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and our YouTube channel at the Haz Mat Guys. And take a moment to call our comment hotline at 843-628-1484.
We are always looking forward to your feedback about information or interesting incidents that you are part of. So send us a note at feedback@thehazmatguys.com.
And remember, guys, don't just get on the job. Get into the job.